Okay, and now screen share. There we go. We're back. We're in this. Okay, so there's a couple things I want you guys to keep an eye out for, as this is the week that you're going to be developing your first game. And there's a couple things that our very first week you were asking me, a couple things that you guys were asking me questions on. Is this acceptable or whatever? And I told many of you, wait, this week will make sense. And then after this week, if it's got questions, we'll talk more about then. I hear myself kind of being repeated in some ways. Whose is that? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Perfect. All right. So here's a couple things I want you to keep an eye out for. I've already mentioned this. It's going to be a strategy game. So I want to make sure that the strategy game that you're developing does not have blind decision making. It's not a clone. There's no rolling and moving, no game boards. I want you to minimize randomness. This should all be based on strategic and meaningful decision making, meaning that you consciously make the decisions you do in your game. You don't just blindly draw from a deck of cards and do what the cards say, or just draft a whole bunch of cards and then play them. You have to really build into things. You have to think like 1 or 2 steps ahead. Remember the Mario analogy I gave you last week? You know, yes, jumping on an enemy is one option, jumping over an enemy is an option, but what happens if you have the enemy after it? What happens to the enemy after that? How do those things combine together to be a string of small questions you ask? How can one card combo into other cards in your game to do more of a thought out action versus just doing one thing and only one thing? That is the big difference between just doing one design choice, one action versus more dynamics to a game. What I mentioned here about no clones, a couple people kind of get worried about this. So I do give you a big list of games saying, hey, go try these games out. Go see what you think about these games. I don't expect you to reinvent the wheel. That's the one thing I'm going to tell everybody right now. So if you like the design of Coup and you like how it's a social deduction game and you want to have something similar, that's fine. That is perfectly acceptable. However, what would not be acceptable is if you literally just copy all the cards, change the artwork, change the text, and tell me it's a different game. That's not acceptable. What is acceptable is if you use that as a foundation, and maybe instead of using their abilities, you change the abilities. Maybe you add more characters. Maybe you add a new system where you can theoretically have 5 rounds to eliminate somebody based on a decision. Like, change the game slightly. Add your own spin on it. That's more what I expect to see happen from this week.
What about something like Ultimate One Night Werewolf? I mean, that's a lot of, I mean...
Yes, but that's more of a party game. Okay. And there is a lot of decision making in there, but there's a couple things also I want you to keep an eye out for. I don't want you to make a game that involves 100 people or whatever, because realistically, you don't have that many people to play test with. And also, most social deduction games, even though Coup is a social deduction game, there are clear abilities you can do in there. And you can choose how you want to do those abilities and when. I want to keep it more minimalist because large-scale party games like that are hard to balance. So a couple of things here I want you to keep an eye out for. So I've mentioned this before, D&D inspired games, tabletop games, things like that. I want you to avoid it. And the reason I want you to avoid it isn't so much they're not strategic, it's just that they're not a beginning, middle, and end. The problem with all these type of designs is that they're open-ended. It's very complicated and it involves a lot of legwork to even play.
It also
you don't
have
just jump into playing a game. You have to pre-make everything ahead of time. You have to pre-make a character. You have to pre-make your stats. And you have to go through a lot of statistics and books before you even get to play the game. On top of that, the game technically can be whatever you want, which a lot of people will argue saying it's a very strategic game, and I would argue and say it's also make-believe. You can also have somebody literally just, you know, magically fall 500 feet, and if the DM allows it, you live. And there's a lot of things that are just more storytelling.
Good DMs won't.
Yeah, and that's kind of my point, is that this type of game is not acceptable because of a couple of reasons. One, the scope is unrealistic. D&D from 4th to 5th edition took 10 years to give perspective.
Yeah.
Actually, it took a little bit longer, and I beta test 5th edition, and I actually beta tested 4th edition, so I can say this.
4th edition was garbage. I didn't like it.
Yeah, but not a lot of people did because it involved math, and nobody likes doing numbers.
Oh, well, there's that too. But
that's really what it came down to. They made 5th edition more simple so people can storytell more, and that's literally in their design notes. So, like, Literally, they want to make a more interactive game, and interactions mean less numbers, more storytelling. That's the reason why you rely on dice for probability of how well you tell a story, but not so much like you do this thing and you get this number and this is what happens. They got away from that. They gave it more like within a spectrum of good and bad things that can happen. Anyway, my point is there's a lot there in any of these type of games. Shadowrun, Edge of the Empire, D&D. I can go on and on. Gamma Worlds. And all these type of games have a lot of decision making, but they also involve a lot of like work ahead of time. As I mentioned, D&D from 4th to 5th edition took over 10 years to develop. Wizard of the Coast has like hundreds of employees. Like I think they have like 500 employees all working on that one project. That is a lot of testing. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of balancing. And that is a large scope. And the key word for today is scope. Everything that I'm talking about would be within the scope limits. I don't want you to develop something that's going to be overwhelming and you can never test it. So that's why I don't want you to develop these type of games. It's not that they're not strategic and they're not whatever, but we cannot just play this in the afternoon. That's the big problem. Like if you brought this game over and say, let's play this, that's a commitment. It's not a game. And that's kind of what I want you to avoid. I want you to make games are one and done. You can play and put it away and put it back in the box. Everything should exist in the box itself.
Mister, can I ask a question?
Sure.
In the previous slide, it said no blind choices. When you say that, is it like completely no blind choices, or is there a minimum tolerance?
So it just depends on your game, but I don't want blind choices to be like the best example, and this is what everyone's going to do. Like there's going to be at least half of you are going to do this by accident. I'm just going to say it right now and call you all on it universally. You have a stack of cards, 100 cards. You have 10 of every whatever you have. You have 10 attack cards, 10 defense cards, 10 magical cards. And instead of you allowing your players to build into those actions, or they have a preset deck of cards that they work with, everyone randomly draws from that deck in the center. And then you're making decisions on your turn, but you're just drawing cards from the center of a table. I don't want you to do something like that because it falls into blind decision making. Is it a decision to play those cards when and where? Yeah, absolutely. But you're not really building into anything. So the Uno analogy is what I will use here. Like if you're going to use it based on Uno, make something like Uno. But if you're going to make a game that involves some strategy, how do you build into the strategy? So no blind decision making should be the main aspect of that. Some blind decision making can be done, but that should be a choice. And we talked about that in the previous class, where if I give you two options, one does 5 damage at a character, the other one is random. It could do between 1 to 100, and you take a gamble, do the second one, and you did 1 damage. You made the choice consciously as a player to do the second action. That's okay, because you allow for them to make the choice, not force them. That's what no blind decision making means.
So we asked about this last week, but I want to clarify, and Kurt asked the same thing. Like I asked previously if a player can draw like 3 cards and then choose 2 and put 1 away. But the other side of that is, say that at the beginning of every round, you flip over like 4 cards face up in the middle of the table, and during their turns, players can pull from that. So they're drawing a card, but they're not doing it blind. They're looking at the options available on the table.
They're making decisions.
Yeah.
Again, what I use the analogy of drawing from the center deck and everyone gets a hand of cards and they just do things that the cards say, as I'm kind of calling everybody out because it happens every month and I'm kind of sick of it. And I don't really have a term for that other than lazy. So I'm just going to say it very directly. It's lazy. Please do not just make a stack of cards in the center that you all draw from and do what the cards say. I want you to start thinking, how do I build into things? What actions can I do on my turn? What lets me win within the first 5 turns if I think it out? Think of it like a strategy game. And you don't get that same immersion or that same design decisions from a game that you draw random cards from. $20 says someone who isn't in lecture will do that. Oh yeah, absolutely. I get it every month. But this is recorded now. So they can watch it later. And then if they say, oh, I didn't know that, I can say, well, it was recorded and there were 29 people in there that heard it that all can confirm it. So yeah.
Even if the 29 deny it, you still have the recording.
Yeah, well, no, you've all consented because it's a recorded right now. All right, so hopefully it's making a little bit more sense of why I want you to try to keep an eye out for it, but I'm going to explain more so this gives more perspective. So another thing I want you to avoid, CCG style games. And this kind of actually falls into what I was just joking about. I do not want you to make a collectible card game. And I know it's kind of confusing. I'm telling you I want you to do a card game, but I don't want you to make a collectible card game that what you're supposed to make. CCG style games are designed to be something that you build. Their design model is that you have to spend time collecting cards that give you things that you want to build a deck that you would like to play with. You don't just go and buy a deck of cards and you play. It takes time. You have to think about what you want to do, and you have to go buy packs of cards, and you have to build a deck of cards before you even get to play the game. You have to do homework before you get to play. So aside from drafting, for anyone who plays Magic, like the drafts, it's something special. Normal Magic the Gathering requires that you go buy a starter set, figure out what type of cards you like, then go buy more booster packs that are currently in the season, and then get the cards that work for you and start building up your deck of cards, and then you can play the game based on all those things you collected. So it's designed for you to constantly update your design of what you're playing, or of, like, you know, it's your strategy.
What about like the game Gwent? Would that be?
That's still TCG kind of.
It's Gwent is designed a little bit like that, and man, can you guys like not mention video games when you ask these? And I gotta remember how Gwent works. I know it's from The Witcher. If I remember correctly, Gwent has some CCG style elements to it because I see them at the board game shop every once in a while. So I'm going to say probably not. What would be allowed? Here's what's allowed: games like Legendary, Ascension, Myst,
Dominion.
Dominion. Yes, thank you.
Those are all.
Susie?
Sushi Go, the one that you're showing?
Yeah, but I'm talking about more for like deck building games. Those are all games are deck building where you all start with the same resources, and there are cards that you can purchase every turn to change your hand of cards. Star Realms, that's the other one I was thinking. The difference between a deck building game and a CCG style game is in a CCG style game, you have to go build and buy everything on your own, and then you get to play the game later.
We're playing a game, not a hobby.
Yes. Whereas Dominion, Legendary, all those, you buy the box, and then when you want to play with your friends, you take
everything's there.
Everything's there. You play, the cards are available. It's self-contained. That's the difference, and that's what I want you to emulate if you do want to make a deck building style game. Again, Legendary, Dominion, Ascension, those are all games that you can play with, I think, 8 stacks of cards, with each card having 10 cards each. So 80 cards right there. And then everybody starts off with like a hand of like, I think 10 cards. There are mostly money and some victory points in your hand. And then at that, you decide what you want to buy. Victory points, cards to do abilities or whatever. And you keep drafting every turn. And then you do your new hand of cards every time. You do it live and you make decisions what's available to you. That's a good design. And that's more I want you to try to emulate as far as what's acceptable. So again, CCG style games, your problem is it'll be impossible to balance it. That's really the big reason I want you to avoid it. It's a scope thing. Every card does something different. Every card balances it in a different way. They all synergize together. They all counter each other a certain way. There's a lot that goes into CCG style games, and I don't want you to get overloaded with trying to make 1,000 different cards, and then you don't get the play test. Think of it this way. Love Letter has 12 cards to play the whole game. Why do you need more? Ask that question. Why do you need more? And give a good reason to why you need more. If the answer is I need more choices, that's not necessarily true. It's probably just you don't have good choices in your game currently with the abilities you have. And you're just trying to fill in a void. Design what you have at a minimalist level, and then you can add on top of it as a foundation. Strong foundations build strong gameplay. Without a good foundation, no matter how much you have in the game, it's still going to be weak. And there's a lot of video games that fall into this design model that you can think of that if you think about the core gameplay, it wasn't that good, and they kept building around that and ignore that fact until it's too late. And there's a lot, like you guys talked about earlier. So,
poor Anthem.
Yeah. So here's another game, another thing I want you to avoid. Common knowledge or suggestive knowledge to influence behavior. Cards Against Humanity, for example, is a fun game. It's a party game. It's a game that doesn't really have a clear winning objective other than making your friends laugh. yes, you can argue saying the person who gets the most black cards wins the game, but when's the last time you've played Cards Against Humanity and you stop playing when somebody has the most cards? It's more.
Doesn't happen.
I played it.
A really good party.
Yeah, it's kind of my point is that those type of games are designed just to be more like icebreakers and jokes, more so than design and thinking. It's like for every person that jokes like that, there's people who play chess. And I'm trying to get you to think more like the people who play chess. Think more in the middle. I don't want you to think about like jokes and humor as meaningful choice because that's not really decision making. That's more blind decision making. And on top of that, trivia is another form of that I want you to avoid. I'll give you a great example. Except for maybe David and Johnny, probably the rest of you won't know this because we're pretty close. Like we're in our 30s. Like it looks like we're like 30-something-year-olds. Now the rest of you who are probably like barely 18, but do you remember back in the Transformers movie, and not the Michael Bay one, the original cartoon one?
Oh my God!
Do you remember when Optimus Prime died? Like it was a big deal, and you probably heard about that. But do you know what happened to that one kid on the news afterwards that was all over the media that affected the whole franchise for the rest of its whole life? Do you know what caused that?
Wait, what kid?
Yeah, see, you don't even know.
I don't.
You're too young. You got freaking Frankie One Piece logo. I already know you're too young just by looking at your icon.
Damn.
No, I remember that.
Damn. Wait to throw me down.
I'm sorry. I have to
No,
kick you
don't worry.
down.
No,
to
this is
understand
actually like fingering us because we're way too old.
Hey,
But my
I'm
point
26,
is,
man.
Yeah, only probably me, David and Johnny and me are the only three who know this. But here's what happened. A kid got so upset that Optimus Prime died, he cried and locked himself in the closet for a week. And it got in the news publicly about it. And they got all the way to Hasbro about it. And Hasbro was like, oh shit, what do we do? And we made a big mistake. We lost our biggest franchise. And they're like, oh, just bring him back in the next season, the cartoon. And then that's what they've been doing for over 30 years now. That's why in the movies he comes back to life. That's why in the cartoons he comes back to life. He became Robot Jesus. And that is a real thing. And why do I know this? So because of
Well,
that,
the comic books was something different. But
it depends on which franchise of the comic books. Because if there's the
Yeah.
English ones, he stood dead for a long time. But in the American ones, he came back like immediately. But anyway, again, I know all this knowledge, but should I earn a victory point because I'm old?
Yes.
I mean, get off my lawn is what I would say to that. But still,
Yeah.
But my point is that that's not fair. In the same way, like if one of you were trying to explain to me where the history of Yeet came from, and I had to look it up on Meme Finder to really understand it came from a rapper and how the whole thing snowballed from there. It's some no-name rapper that I don't like, but whatever. Yeah, I used to have a hip-hop day. I remember. But my point is that same type of knowledge should not be fair. It's not fair towards your audience because they weren't alive or they weren't able to do something because that's no longer a skill. Common knowledge is not a skill. That's just something you acquire. Games teach you things as you play them. And that's what makes a game interesting. You spent the time learning something and you gain a mastery over it. And therefore, it is fun. And you can compare your skill level to your friends. Pokemon's a great example of a game that's all based around skill level, of how much time you put into it is how well you do in the game, as well as building your teams and things like that, the decisions you make in there. And the game is very simple in its core roots. It's rock, paper, scissors. In its core, it's a simple game and it's approachable, but in its integration for you and your friends, you all have your own skill levels based on what you put into it. Common knowledge is never a skill. It is something that's assumed. And the problem with common knowledge is also it can actually cause a problem with the people who play your game because common knowledge may not be common for where they live. I use the Transformer analogy because I'm old and only like the old people in the room would get it. But let's say we brought up something historical that happened only in France and none of us are from Europe. So we really
Nobody
don't know.
knows. Yeah.
No one would know that.
Some people lost their heads over that.
Well, I'll give you the best example. There was a game that came out years ago. They've had it was going to have a spin-off, but then the guy quit the internet forever. It was a game called Fez. It's been on Indie Game the Movie. I'd recommend everyone to go watch that to understand how developing games kind of work on a more primitive level. But the reason I bring up that guy is that he had a puzzle in his game that only could be solved by Americans. and it's a very simple puzzle that if I were to explain it right now, everyone would get it. The specific of the puzzle was the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. That is an American expression we use when teaching English and writing.
I really don't get it.
Yeah.
You already get it. Like, I don't even have to get into this. So everyone that was not from America, the Caribbean, or they were from like Europe or whatever, had no idea what that expression meant. So they had no idea how to solve the puzzle. So Americans solved the puzzle within the first week. Europeans and internationally couldn't solve the puzzle for a whole year until it got leaked online. That was the way you solved it. And that became a problem of design because it was using common knowledge as a design model. Outside factors affected the game. And that's the problem. When you have outside factors that affect your game, it is suggested behavior, it's suggested humor, it's suggested knowledge or common knowledge. It's not fair. So that's the reason, I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but you can see how all of these type of designs, like the whole party game genre, fall into suggestive behavior. Because things that we find funny as Americans, if you were to play this in Europe, probably half of those things won't make sense to them. It probably would, and that's kind of my point, is that like there are regions that will find things humorous for the region. Video games have the same problem where we have to make sure that we develop things that we have to make it for a broad audience. That's why sometimes we can't have cultural things in most games. That's why almost all games are make-believe nations and make-believe cultures. The instant you influence certain cultures and you have that in the game, it's hard for a player to understand that. And if you want the best example of that ever, just watch any anime in existence and watch an English dub of it and try to figure out why they're eating Japanese food and what they call it in English.
Donuts.
Jelly donuts.
Jelly donuts.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my point. Video games has had the same problem before. So as a designer, do you have to worry about this stuff? Yes and no. This is something that you will have to think about as a designer. How do I make things approachable that anybody can play? How can I make it that any region can play my game? And you do that by making things that are all decision-making. Decision-making is things that can be taught to you in any language. Once you make
Please translate your games.
Say again?
Please translate your games. As someone that was born, like, as a Brazilian, there's barely any games that's related to Portuguese. So a bunch of times I would just get stuck because I don't know what the hell to do. It's all in English.
Kind of my point. It's only built for the audience. And it's not built for other audiences. So designing things that can be translated, that they're universal, that's a good design. And that makes your game accessible. And that's the key word I also want to point out today. Accessibility and scope. Those are two things I want you to think about. How accessible have you made your game? Can anybody play it? Do you need to know outside factors to play the game? If you do, that's a problem. If you can learn everything by playing the game itself, once you know the rules, that's all you need. Making sense?
Yes, sir.
Is the baby doing okay? I see you're holding the baby. Like, I'm afraid like I'm raising my voice too loud. So like, please tell me if like I'm getting too loud for the kid, man.
She's a heavy sleeper.
Okay. Just making sure.
Signed up for this, so.
All right. My friend's the same thing. Like, I'm in business meetings with him, and like his like son's like right there, and I have to keep my voice down because every time I talk to him, the baby just hears me and wakes up.
No worries.
All right. Okay. So, mechanics. When I talk about gameplay mechanics, what are some of the things you think about? I just want to kind of hear a broad spectrum of what people think.
UI.
Well, it's more of like, do you have to draw a card? How do you play a card? Do you collect resources? Do you collect money? How do you spend it? How do you, interact with the other players? How do they interact with you? How do you interact with a shared situation? Things like that.
When I think of mechanics, as I play a lot of MOBAs, the main thing I think is skill. A lot of people use mechanics as just a word for skill, mostly macro and micro skill.
So in Gratis, would this be items for mechanics?
No, I'm just asking, what do you think mechanics are? Like when I ask you like gameplay mechanics, like where's your mind go?
I think you have to, in my mind,
The gameplay
means that you have to do something to progress through the game.
Like to
Right.
get from A to point B.
Yeah.
Right.
I would say how a player interacts with the game as a whole. whether that be from
Right.
How the
How
player
the game
actually played the
plays.
game.
Yeah.
And that's kind of my point. Is like mechanics are all the things that you do, like the rules that you learn in the game. They're the interactions in the game, and they're the mechanics that teach you different things you can do. And then based on those things you can do, they can lead to different responses, different outcomes, and that leads to skill once you learn how certain things work, and you learn when and where to do those certain things in the game. And that's where the skill comes in. Learning how to operate, how the game operates, exactly. So yes, gameplay mechanics are the things that you do. They're the interactions. They are the main things of the game. Games fall into two structures, or they fall into two realms. They fall into a structure and they fall into a genre. We were talking about this earlier with the whole RTS thing off camera, where we were talking about how since StarCraft 2, there really is not a RTS game that's currently out, but we mentioned that that's a genre of game, and that is a type of skill level and entry cap and all that. And taking away the whole thing about the sports side of it and the marketability side of it, we're just looking at it from a gameplay perspective. We're looking at the skill necessary to play the game and the mechanics for how the game works, where it's building the bases and units and the skill of when to place them and how to place them and gather resources and so on. So the game teaches you those aspects, but there's also the mechanics that go behind it for every race and every character and how they function. And you learn those things as time goes on, and you operate and play the game how you feel comfortable with the resources given to you. So every game falls into a type of competitive structure. Even analog games fall into this. Like 1v1 style games, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, team games. David was talking about this earlier, where you can have a team versus a team with different objectives. Like Team A has objectives and Team B has a totally different set of objectives to win the game. Werewolf is a great example of that. All the all-style games is the most common design that you see in analog, where it's 2 players, it's 2 to 6 players going against each other, and only one person can win. So it'll be a game of interaction, but usually only one winner. Boss Monster, Coup, what was the other one? Lotus, Sushi Go, all great examples of games. Munchkin. Everyone plays against each other, but only one winner. The next 3, though, are special. I use one versus many with the hide and go seek thing here as an example, but I don't really have games that I like for you to emulate here because, in my opinion, one versus many games are asymmetric games, and asymmetric games are extremely hard to balance correctly. I mean, truly asymmetric games, not like one race versus another race. We're talking about like 1 versus 5 people, that type of asymmetric gameplay.
So like Evolve.
I was actually just about to get to that. So Evolve actually had this problem where it was an awesome concept, but it was a high skill level game where it was very difficult for the players to play that game because in order to defeat the monster, you had to have people that cooperated very well together and coordinated all the character abilities because you played with squad of 4. If you're the monster, well, you know, it was just you versus
Kind of
people.
the same thing with like Dead by Daylight.
Dead by Daylight. So
Friday the 13th.
yes, and all these games are fun, but they're very, very hard to balance. Evolve is a great example of a game that had a lot of balancing issues because they kept making the monster too tough, and then when they nerfed the monsters and they buffed the humans, then the humans became too tough. And it became this fine balancing act of what was acceptable based on skill versus what the game presented to you as, you know, the gameplay abilities. So unfortunately, what wound up happening was Evolve would have people that were really good with the monster and not good with the humans, and no one would choose the humans. So you had AI companions, or you would have teams of people that didn't know each other playing together, and they would not coordinate and they would get slaughtered. And it became very one-sided. It became a very asymmetric game. And then later, that is the opposite problem, where the humans became way easy to play, and the monster became a little bit nerfed, and then the monster is so easy to kill that no one wanted to play the monster anymore. Everyone wanted to play the humans. You kept running into this back and forth problem where they made these totally asymmetric gain-up mentality behavior. And that's another key word I want to point out, gain-up behavior. That means that everybody targets one person and all beats them up. And Munchkin's actually a great example of a game that has gain-up behavior. That's why that game never ends.
Yes.
Monopoly is a great example of a game that has gain-up behavior that never ends for that reason, which is why I laugh when people say everyone has to go bankrupt. I'm like, no, Just one. But you still
Munchkin,
have
I
to-
mean, everybody, like, the first person to get to level 9, like, everybody piles on them. And
Brad
then
piles on him.
either the
Absolutely.
next person, the very next person who wins because they're close enough and everybody's burned all their stuff to screw the last person, or if somebody's smart, they don't spend it all, and then it just never ends because people are constantly trying to screw each other, and it just takes forever, and the fun goes away.
I want to go play Munchkin.
Yeah, and that's
Would
kind of
For Honor fall in that category? Because For Honor is basically like one player versus another player, but they both have like armies with them.
no.
It's still 1v1.
No.
Yeah.
What it would be is like literally like a 4 players versus 1 player.
Okay.
Like that's game up behavior, and that's also 1 versus many.
Like the new Predator hunting ground.
Right. They're already running into that problem I was just explaining. Like they're already
Yeah.
balancing issues with that exact problem. And it's not that it can't be done. It's just it's very
It's hard. Yeah.
So the Grizzled, I have listed here for versus system games. And versus system games are my favorite design. It's the players versus the game itself. And only one winner could come out from the game itself. So everyone's competing against the game itself in some way. And they are trying. I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo somewhere. Who's that?
Poor Josh. He keeps trying to get in.
Right.
Yeah, Josh. I keep
I
having to-
see you doing that.
I keep having to mute you and unmute you because like there's an echo coming from yours, like really hard.
He's
So
on a phone. I think that's why.
yeah, I'm gonna leave you muted, but then when you have a question, just unmute yourself, okay? Cool. All right, I'm gonna assume that like we thumbs up on that one.
Oh, man.
I feel bad, but like
I feel so bad
Yeah.
for the guy.
Okay. Anyway, so versus system games are games that are you versus the game itself. So Pandemic is a great example of a game where everyone has different roles and responsibilities, and you're all in it together. You're all
PvEs.
cooperating together. And if you lose, it's not an individual loss. Everyone loses. These are my favorite styles of games because they're highly interactive. They require that everyone does a part and everyone thinks a step ahead. Pandemic's a great example. The Grizzled is another game. A great
PvE
example of that.
games in general, like Left 4 Dead.
Yeah, Left 4 Dead. I'm trying to use more analog games here because
Oh, yeah.
I want you to start thinking about analog.
I just don't know that many analogs.
That's the reason why a lot of these I'm mentioning. I would like for you as the class to try to play test these on Tabletop Simulator or on the board game website that I offered to you. So you get a chance to try some of these games out.
Mm-hmm.
Dark Souls, the board game. You mean the card game or the board game? They made 2 of them. The board? Okay. And then I think the board game is based off the Kingdom of Death monster system, which they borrowed very heavily from, which is a cooperative game. So yeah, I'm going to probably say it's probably really similar. But yes, that's kind of my point, is that you have these games that are very highly interactive that has everyone working together. And that's kind of a really good design to look at. But just because of the structure doesn't mean that there is not a way to kind of think of a formula for how to fit that structure. Listed here are all the different type of analog game formulas that exist. So earlier, when I was mentioning deck building games, I was mentioning Ascension, Legendary, Coup, or I'm sorry, not Coup, Legendary, Ascension, Dominion. Those are deck building style games. My point is that you can take any 2 of these and come up with a game design idea behind it that use these as a principal mechanic. Each one of these should represent the core principle and a sub-principle of your game, meaning the foundation and the sub-foundation of what you build around. So for example, you can make a game that has cooperation and deck building as its main 2 things. It is a cooperative game where you are deck building up your Godzilla monster to fight aliens or something, I don't know, versus the system itself. You're going against the game itself, and every couple of turns you have to build a new Godzilla monster to fight against this, threat. But you deck build by doing it. You actually deck build up how your monster fights, what combos of cards, hacking, slashing, breathing atomic breath, whatever. And this is just me pitching from the first thing that came to my head just now. My point is that you can take any two of these and come up with an interesting dynamic of gameplay incorporating those two elements. The cooperative element is you can have like 3 players maybe representing different Godzilla monsters that all do different attacks or different synergies together that do more damage. You know, one heals, one attacks, one tanks, for example. Treat it like a raid. That's just an example.
Team-based King of Tokyo, kind of.
Maybe. It's just, will it work game design-wise? I don't know. But it's a foundation to go from. It's an idea. And this is what many of you were asking me last week. Like, I have this idea for this and 4 cards, and put them on a table and flip them. What should I do? And this and that. And I was trying to explain to everyone last week, but I wanted to get you to this point. It doesn't matter what your idea is. I can say that it's a good or bad idea, and it still may not be necessarily good or it may not necessarily be bad. What it can be is unacceptable if you want to make a party game. If you ask me something like that, I'll say no. But if you're asking me games that involve a lot of strategy and choice, the simple thing I always tell all of you is it borrowing elements from one of these formulas? Are you doing like a deck building game? Are you doing a drafting game, a bluffing game? And how heavily are you using those elements of your game? How interactive is that part of your game? And if it's only one time, that's a problem. You might want to have it reoccur. If it's something that's reoccurring, then how accessible is it? How often does it happen? How hard is it to use? How simple is it to use? The accessibility of it. And then just play test it. That's really going to always give you the best answer. We can make games all day long and say that they're fun, but as soon as we give them to someone else, they're going to say otherwise. You see how fans are on social media. I don't need to get into that. Like, you can see how quickly people will give you their opinion but not offer solutions. As a designer, you have to figure out those solutions to make people happy. And square one is always going to be, well, what did I give the players to play with to begin with? Make sure that you give them the things that they want. They only get to make one choice? Probably not what they want. Give them multiple choices? Good. Variety. Okay, how difficult were those choices? How easy were those choices? How useful were those choices? All things you have to think about. My group just played, and then we got stuck in the boss battle and quit. It just kept on going forever. Kingdom of Death Monster and all those type of games are, they last a long time. I think we did an encounter in KOD that lasted 4 hours one time because it was just hitting and running away and hitting and running away. It was just like Dark Souls are just boring. It was just boring after a certain point because you had to literally dance back and forth to hit it. Some of those games they emulate the things too well, in my opinion. But that's just personal preference. But anyway, so
what's trick taking? That's not somebody else asked that too, but it's not something I've ever heard of.
Trick taking is it's kind of like think like building suits of cards. So like it's like blackjack and it's
taking
like
tricks.
It's that. It's like scoring books, spades. Those are all examples of trick taking. I want you to only design something like that if there are choices involved, not that it's just purely like a deal cards and do the best you can every turn. That's what I want you to avoid, because then that's going based on chance again. So what I want to do is a quick little experiment for everyone. We didn't get a chance to play Dominion as a group, and I want everyone to play Dominion later tonight if you get some free time, or tomorrow with each other. That is available on tabletop, and it's available also, I think, on the board game website, if you can. If you can't play it, then I want everybody to watch videos of Dominion. We're going to talk about this in the next class, and I want to talk about the gameplay mechanics and how they actually influence the game itself. Like, what did you do in the game? What is involved? So very much like how we did for Sushi Go, I want to review this, but I'm going to do it for next class because I forgot to mention this on Friday. So we're going to skip ahead, and we'll come back to that on Wednesday. But balance. That's the next thing I want to talk about. When I talk about balance in games, where does your mind go? Like, where are some of the things you think about?
Making sure that
one player doesn't have an advantage over the other.
Right. Or one weapon or one piece of armor or item.
Making it fun.
Yeah.
Like, in my opinion, balance has always been the purpose of fun.
Well, yeah, I think there's that. It's like, I think to kind of expand on what was said is balance is about, not giving any one player or group significant advantage over the other ones.
In a way that makes it unfair.
Yeah.
Frustrating.
You want to make it as fair as possible so that it relies on skill and stuff like that.
And that's where the fun comes from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For some people that they don't want the skill, they don't want that to be a significant portion of their game. They just want to play something to have fun and don't want to have to think too heavily about it. So you've got to figure out that balance too. How can you make it so that the most people can enjoy your game without, having just such a niche market?
Right. Hold on 1 second, class. I have to respond to after this. Okay, sorry. I just got a text from house stuff in between all this, so my apologies.
good.
You okay?
Yeah, just 5 o'clock and a day, like, oh, now we need all this paperwork, and I'm like, cool. I know we're working from home, but I'm glad to see that 5 o'clock and a day does not change no matter what's going on. That's great. Anyway, so right. And that's kind of what I want to get at. So it's all about what feels fair and what does not feel fair to a player. It's all about the balance of the game. And
that's a great example right there.
I actually was going to get into this. So in Halo, the original Halo, there was a very dominant strategy in the game itself. For those of you who played Halo 1, can any of you think about what would have been the dominant strategy? Like, what was the gun that was just too good?
Magnum. Battle rifle.
Plasma pistol and Magnum.
I said Halo.
Oh, and 1.
Magnum.
Yeah, the Magnum.
Magnum. Yeah.
New combo.
So that's the whole thing. The Magnum itself is a very OP weapon. Yes, like it is a very OP weapon. It was just extremely powerful. It was just as good as a sniper rifle in the right hands of a player, and it was a starting weapon in the game. It was a big problem with accessibility. They made it so accessible that it made all the other weapons irrelevant for online play. It became such a problem that in Halo 2, they got rid of the Magnum and replaced it with a different weapon altogether, which was the dual-wielding SMGs, which were fun, but they were not as powerful as Magnum.
They weren't Magnums.
They weren't Magnums. And they found it, and you can argue saying, well, they had a dominant strategy in Halo 2 with the battle rifle and the charging of the gun, and you're absolutely right. They found another way to make the game very dominant in strategy, and people got angry when you would do that online because it was such an easy 1-2 hit. Yeah. It didn't involve much skill, and everyone was a good killer, quote unquote, on there. So good players that used all the weapons felt like they were being cheated. And then when Halo 3 came out, they tried to balance it again, and people found things again. But my point is, dominant strategies exist in games, but when you have only the dominant strategy being the best available option, it is a big problem for game design. And it becomes such a big problem. Bunny hopping for the win. Like it actually, it only plays the game in one manner. You have to be very careful when it comes to balancing out your games and making sure that you offer your players choices, but make sure that you don't give a dominant choice as the best choice in the game. Like if you offer them 2 options and one does 100 damage, one does 1, why would you ever choose the 1 damage?
I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier in like before it with WoW, like, you look and like everybody says there's one specific spec, one specific gear set that you need to be the best. You want to play the game at that level, you can only do that one specific set of things. And it makes it boring. It's like, why do I want to be the same as everybody else?
Right. And
Overwatch had a lot of this problem.
Yeah. You see a lot of this problem also in MOBA games, in my opinion, where everybody plays the same characters over and over. And fighting games as well. You see the same people play the same characters over and over because they become the dominant factors. So when you have people that break that norm, it actually adds a lot of life and variety because unfortunately dominant strategies become a very active thing in online gaming. So when you see an underdog playing a character that's not used and doing very well, like totally destroying people with a certain character that normally is not played that way, it makes it very engaging and exciting to watch because from your personal experience that Ryu hits like a truck, and you're gonna see you're going to see a lot of players that play Kuma online, but you're not going to see people that play the new characters like Fane or not Jury, the Brazilian girl in Street Fighter 5. I forgot.
Laura.
Yeah, you don't see people playing those characters.
What was the stretchy boy's name?
Dulcine, and people still play Dulcine because he's still good.
Okay.
So it's kind of
hit across the map.
So anyway, What I want to do real quick, though, is I want to talk a little bit more about this, but I want to show the classroom a video on balance that I'm going to do with the website, the We Share, that I should keep
Watch together.
By the way, I looked. I don't see Dominion on the board game website. I thought I saw it previously, but I don't see it there now. I just looked at the list.
Try it on the workshop when you're looking it up on.
Okay.
It's like you don't look it up in the game itself in Tabletop Sim. You have to go into the workshop. Then everyone has the games there.
I was talking about Board Game Arena.
Oh, Board Game Arena? Okay, so it doesn't have it.
I was looking it up on the Steam Workshop for Tabletop Simulator, and the only one that I could find one that was pretty much worth its salt was this Dominion scripted one.
That probably is the one that you're going to want to play.
The scripted ones, if you can find them, can be really great because they could save a lot of effort because you don't have to manually do everything, but it depends on how the scripted ones are built.
Yeah. Okay, so everyone, I'm going to drop a link in here real quick. I'm going to meet the classroom. We're going to watch this, but before you watch it, I'm going to give you all like a 5-minute break, go to the bathroom, go grab a drink or whatever. Then I'm going to watch this, and then we're going to talk about this a little bit more when done. Okay?
Yay.
All right. And this gives me a chance to respond to these people in between all this at the same time. Yay. God, I forgot how to do mute all on here. Mute. All right. I'll give you a few minutes, and this gives me a chance to deal with this in the meantime. And I'm dropping a link in Discord as well, just in case if people don't see it.
Just make the world fun. Just make the world fun.
Well, wait before you
spend
please wait before starting it.
Sorry, I didn't realize it was a together video.
Yeah.
This is the only Call of Duty I've never played.
Isn't the Black Ops 3?
No, it's Infinite Warfare.
It's a sci-fi one, right?
Yeah, the one with the
One
Exos.
of those.
Infinite Warfare was disgusting.
Yeah,
It's the worst Call of Duty ever.
Is that even a Nexus suit? That's just straight up a robot. At least
Yeah.
it looks like.
There is one robot character in Black Ops 3, I think, but
Yeah, Black Ops 3 had a bunch of exosuits.
mm-hmm.
Is it true they're remastering Black Ops 1?
It's a rumor.
Somebody okay?
You all right there?
Jesus.
Got a man down.
He did.
Black Ops 1 has to be the best Call of Duty so far.
A lot of people say 2 is better.
I just like the numbers. 2 is a continuance of 1, though. That's like the end of the storyline.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean by story-wise? Okay. But
Because I was going to say mechanic-wise.
So I don't know what the hell.
Mechanically wise, they was
the new Modern Warfare is better.
But,
Any Call of Duty that did not have an exosuit was actually
Yeah.
they just tried to moderize it, I think. But they went too far with the futuristic stuff.
Yeah, they did. It was
They were trying to keep up with
Everything
Titanfall.
kinda ruined it for me.
Yeah, I prefer the realistic CODs.
I'm good, guys. I'm sorry.
You mean the Modern Warfare ones?
Yeah.
They was trying to compete with Titanfall.
You all right, Josh?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, we just heard like it sounded like you fell or something.
Yeah, I was climbing the ladder, put my equipment back, and I didn't fully secure it.
Damn.
Ouch.
Well, as long as you're not bleeding.
No, I'm not bleeding. I'm good. I didn't break
Just has a concussion.
Do you smell toast?
Yeah. Do you smell toast? Do you taste copper?
You guys get to see what a horrible person I am now.
Nothing like a concussion to really get the blood flowing.
I don't need that.
Hey, what are you doing?
Okay, so
That's a pretty cute cat you got there.
Nice.
let's start the video, and we're all back, and we'll talk in a little bit.
You've probably heard terms like overpowered, cheap, and unfair. What these players are arguing about is the game's balance. The art of making sure that all options in a multiplayer game are fair, so none are underpowered and thus pointless to use, and none are overpowered and thus dominate everything else. Here's the thing though, most video games aren't just striving for balance, but balance among a wide range of distinctly different options. You don't have to work that hard to balance a symmetric game, one where all players have the exact same starting conditions.
Hey Josh, can you
Most
mute your mic
games
again?
are asymmetric, which means players are facing off against each other with completely different stuff. And in a game where players can pick from 74 different fighters or 140 unique champions, the developers are counting on them all being equally viable among players of roughly the same skill level. So how do they do it? Now I should say, balance is an incredibly difficult pursuit. It can be an entire department at certain companies, and Riot's League of Legends has had more than 200 balance patches in the last decade. Plus, it's not just about numbers, but player psychology, with Overwatch's Jeff Kaplan saying the perception of balance is more powerful than balance itself. So this is just not going to be an intensive tutorial. Instead, Game Maker's Toolkit presents a whirlwind tour through the way games are balanced and rebalanced, and rebalanced, and rebalanced, and rebalanced. So how do developers go about balancing a game in the first place? Well, the first consideration is trade-offs. This is when you essentially cancel out a character's competitive advantages with drawbacks. Think of Mario Kart characters, where heavy racers like Donkey Kong have a high top speed but low acceleration, while featherweight racers like Toad are the opposite. On the right track design, they'll be almost evenly balanced. You can think of characters as having a power budget. At least that's what Riot calls it. Advantages are a cost, but disadvantages are a discount. If all characters are just about hitting the limit of the same power budget, they'll be closer to being balanced. It's rarely that easy, of course. I mean, okay, sometimes you'll get a card that does 1 damage to all minions, and another that does 4 damage to all minions. That's an easy one, just to make the second card cost a bit more energy. But how do you calculate the power budget for completely incomparable options like heroes in Overwatch, or options with dozens of stats to tweak, like when Bungie was reining in the initially overpowered sniper rifle in Halo 3, it had loads of stats it could tweak, such as clip size, time to full zoom, reload time, and max ammo. It ultimately decided that the best knob to tweak was the time between shots, which it bumped from 0.5 seconds to 0.7 seconds. What's important, though, is to celebrate the big differences between choices. The sniper rifle and the shotgun offer a more exciting choice to players than 2 types of assault rifle, even though the latter is much easier to balance. So I agree with ex-Blizzard designer Rob Pardo when he warns designers against using the maths to balance games into mediocrity, saying,
Otherwise, you're going to end up with a game, either an army game or classes, where everything kind of feels the same. And, you can high-five each other and say it's balanced, but is it fun? Probably not.
Another consideration is counters. This is when we give characters the ability to negate each other's moves and strategies. For example, a quick Zerg rush in StarCraft is all well and good unless your opponent is 1 step ahead and has already built defensive bunkers. And what we ideally want is for everything to have a counter. So a defensive StarCraft player can, in turn, be countered by a more economical strategy, where you save up resources to build units that can eventually crush those bunkers into dust. And we could make a counter to that counter, and so on. But then we'd be here forever. There's a more elegant solution though. Because how do you deal with someone who's sitting around saving up money? Well, a rush. And wouldn't you know it, it's rock, paper, scissors. This goofy game you play to see who has to do the washing up might be incredibly simple and lacking any strategic depth, but it is perfectly balanced because everything has a counter and everything is a counter.
Damn, man. Build those scissors.
And that's why it forms the backbone of a lot of multiplayer games. Pretty much every fighting game has a system like this, such as Dead or Alive, which boasts about its triangle system, where strikes beat throws, throws beat holds, and holds beat strikes. In strategy games, it's not just the strategies that work like this, but the individual units. And the different Pokemon types sit in a massive web of interlocking counters, but starting, of course, with fire, water, and grass. Rock, paper, scissors is a great balancing framework to start from because you can ensure that no element is overpowered. It's countered by something, and no choice is irrelevant. It at least works as a counter to something else. And also, in strategy games at least, it encourages mixed strategies. It makes you into a multidisciplinary player, and it forces you to switch tactics on the fly in a really dynamic way. And in class-based games, it's a great way of automatically making mixed teams. Take Team Fortress 2, where 7 of its 9 classes fit into a complex web of interlocking and interchangeable triangles of rock, paper, scissors. Here, teams must pick complementary classes to protect each other from weaknesses. If you're an engineer and spies keep stacking your sentries, then you're going to need to get one of your teammates to switch to Pyro. These counters are often described as hard counters if they completely shut something down, like a punch is a hard counter to a throw in arms because it will nullify the effect every single time. But soft counters just mean one choice will have an advantage over the other. McCree will outperform Tracer, but his chance of winning is far from 100%. And when it comes to counters, it's really important to figure out what are the hands and what are the throws. The hands are the things that get locked in before the match even starts. You know, the characters and the races. The throws are the things you pick during the match. The moves, the units, and the strategies. And in a team-based game like Overwatch, the entire team is the hand, while the individual players are the throws. The throws are specifically designed to be unbalanced against each other to create that back and forth counterplay and teamwork. But the hands are supposed to be balanced, so they should have access to all of the throws. If Zangief simply couldn't block, for example, he would be unusable. So you've got a bunch of characters with trade-offs and counters, and you think you've made them balanced. But how do you actually make sure that's true? Well, this is when we start collecting data, either from internal playtesters or the millions of people playing your game online. Now, you might think that all you need to do is track how often each character results in success, i.e. its win rate. And if a character has a 50% win rate, it's balanced. But, like all stats, this can be misleading. Imagine a fighting game with 3 characters, and if Ryu won every match against Chun-Li and lost every match against Cammy, his win rate would be 50%. Perfectly balanced though? I think not. That's why matchup charts, where you can see the win rate of a character when played against all other characters, are so important. But even that's not going to tell you everything. Riot had a problem with the League of Legends character, Akali. The numbers said she was pretty balanced, with a 44% win rate, perhaps a tad underpowered. So how come she secured a 72% win rate at the 2018 World Championship and was banned more times than any other champion? It's because while she was really powerful, she was difficult to play effectively. She had a super high skill floor, in other words. So while top-tier players could use her to wipe the floor with the competition, the low-ranking players using Akali were getting killed left, right, and center. Therefore, her win rate was being dragged down. That's why it's important to look at a character's win rate and matchups across all skill levels. And finally, win rate doesn't really tell you what's actually going on in the game. We need to know what characters people are actually picking. People might be avoiding a character who is otherwise well-balanced because that character is not much fun to play, or is only useful in certain situations. Blizzard found that Overwatch hero Symmetra was a largely balanced character, but she wasn't being picked as much because her use was highly situational. So in her first complete redesign, they tried to make her more popular by giving her 2 ultimates to pick from, a teleporter and a shield generator. That's why player feedback is so important, as well as pick rate, which tells you how often a character is actually getting used. For Rainbow Six Siege, Ubisoft uses a matrix to cross-reference both win rate and pick rate, with different considerations needed for operators who fall into these 4 buckets. And the pick rates help tell you the state of the meta, which is essentially just the characters, cards, strategies, and so on that the community at large have found the most effective and are currently using. This is often shared through forum posts, fan-made tier lists, YouTube videos, and esports victories. When a kid called Jason won the Clash Royale tournament in Helsinki, his chosen cards suddenly became massively popular. And the meta can actually act as a self-balancing force. Let's say everyone discovered that a certain character was overpowered and everyone started using it. It's now in everyone's best interest to try and discover strategies that can counter or outperform that favorite. And if players find it, the meta might change. This rolling meta keeps the game fresh and gives the players who found the counter a real sense of satisfaction. Overwatch's Jeff Kaplan says, regarding the meta changing because players have innovated a new strategy, well, this is the best case scenario. We've seen this happen time and time again. Of course, that's not always going to work. Sometimes the designers will have to go in and change things. If a strategy is overpowered, if a character is never getting played, or if a playstyle is proving annoying, then it's time to swing the hammer. First, the devs need to figure out the exact reason why that character or strategy or whatever is unbalanced. It's easy to see that a character is dominating the matchup charts, but can be harder to pinpoint why. So for a character like Meta Knight in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, it was mostly because of his extremely fast attack speed and an ability to cancel his momentum in midair and avoid being KO'd. He had lots of advantages and not enough trade-offs, and other characters don't have the tools to counter him. Once the source has been found, you've got to figure out what to nerf and what to buff. Nerfing means making something less powerful, like reducing their speed, limiting their range, or cutting down their strength. Buffing is the opposite, making it more powerful. You don't necessarily have to buff the weak characters and nerf the strong ones, though. You could leave an overpowered character alone, but buff the characters who counter them and still solve the same problem. Make sure you watch this Core A gaming video on why buffs are generally better than nerfs. Balance changes can be anything from a tiny tweak to a character's movement speed to a complete overhaul of how a character works. It might be a fundamental change to the rules of the game. Rainbow Six Siege made attacking and defending more balanced by changing the match time to 3 minutes. And sometimes you've just got to pull things from the game entirely, like when Epic scrapped the overpowered Infinity Blade in Fortnite. But any change is going to affect players, especially those who are very used to the way a specific character or its counters work. So when the game gets patched, it's important to communicate the changes through patch notes and videos and so on. In fact, patch notes are so important that Riot once put out a note saying a champion was nerfed, but forgot to actually implement the nerf in the code. Even so, the character's pick rate plummeted, and even his win rate decreased a bit. Didn't I say that player psychology was an important factor? Now, at the beginning of this video, I said that balance was about trying to make characters equally viable among players of roughly the same skill level. But what happens when players aren't at the same skill level? Well, a lot of highly competitive games use matchmaking systems to pair up similarly skilled players. But for more accessible, party-style games, we may want to build in negative feedback loops or catch-up mechanics, where players who are doing poorly get a helping hand. Examples are the death streak mechanic in Modern Warfare 2, where you get a special bonus for dying a whole bunch. And the item system in Mario Kart, where powerful items, including that pesky blue shell, are only given to players at the back of the pack. These are pretty contentious and must be used sparingly. We could also reduce the value of skill by adding in more luck. We see this in most family board games like Snakes and Ladders and Monopoly, which are heavily based on the luck of the die roll. But in video games, you see this in games like Apex Legends, where your chances of winning are shifted based on what goodies you find when you drop into the map. Games can also offer handicapping modes, and in team-based games, we can give players alternative playstyles that allow them to contribute to the team without needing to do highly skilled frontline action, like being a mech or an engineer. So balancing a game is a really challenging job. The more you make characters distinct, the harder it is to put them on an even playing field. And that's not taking into account players of unequal skill levels. We can try to design in trade-offs to ensure characters don't have too many advantages, and give characters counters so they can keep each other in check. But even the best designs won't stand up to scrutiny when put in front of millions of players. So we need to constantly determine the balance by watching win rates, matchups, pick rates, and player feedback. And while hopefully the meta will naturally shift in response to imbalance, sometimes devs have to go in and make the hard changes. And then you introduce a whole new character and everything breaks again. I said this wasn't an easy job. So let me know, what do you think is the most balanced game around? And have you ever played a game where the devs just got it oh so wrong? Let me know your experience with balance in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I had a lot of help on this one from people who know multiplayer games really.
All right. So, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So, so hope that gives a little bit more perspective of what I was getting at about the art of balancing. Where if you have certain things that feel fair to a player, it's good. But like when everything all based around numbers and just like statistics of things, like yeah, it makes sense on paper, but then when they play it, it doesn't feel good. This is the fine art of balancing that I was trying to get at a little bit earlier. Where even though sometimes you have a dominant strategy, it may not necessarily be a bad thing, but you want to make sure that you have some sort of counter towards an overly dominant strategy where it's the only thing they get to choose from. And then the illusion of choice is also a thing you want to be careful about, where if you give something that feels like it's going to be very strong, but it's actually very weak, that's also a big problem. With all that being said, there is a lot that goes into balancing. And as you kind of can hear, like even one change can drastically change the way that people feel about something. League of Legends is a great example of like they give a number and they say they're going to change something and drastically changes the way that people play the game, even if they didn't even incorporate it. Like the drop rate of a character was just plummeting because they don't want to deal with that rebalance. It's not going to feel good to them anymore. And that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. Making sense?
Yes,
Okay.
I think what I was going to say is, balance that. I mean, that's why team comp, was such a big thing for a lot of games, was because they were trying to figure out ways to balance everything,
right?
To make up for the the pros and cons of different characters and things like that.
So, correct, and all of those things kind of give a perspective of how to play the game that's more accessible, and it goes all the way back to the game before, where if things aren't balanced, it doesn't feel very accessible. Like it feels very one-sided. It feels like very chaotic. Team Fortress is a great example of a game that was very balanced at one point, but then they kept introducing new elements that changed the gameplay. They kept introducing new ways to play the characters that did breathe new life into the game itself, but then also caused a lot of problems where the game felt totally unbalanced, and it felt like it was just complete chaos. There's no way to keep track of things. And it's because every character played slightly different. And it was no longer like 8 characters. What is it? There's 9 characters. I knew it was for game 1. There's 9 characters, and before it was perfectly a rock, paper, scissors type of mechanic of what beat what. But now every character had like 6 different variations of how they can play. So now the game became like somewhere like around 40 different ways to play the game, and became a big problem.
No, in Team Fortress case, it actually worked well for them that it all became chaos. Most people that play Team Fortress, they're not looking for competitive. They just
because the
want to
game's
play
no longer
well.
competitive. They used to.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember playing Team Fortress Classic competitive before competitive gaming was a major thing.
Right. But we could tell everybody in the room to get off our lawn. So, but that's kind of the point, is that Team Fortress is just an example of a game that used to have that structure, but now has lost that. I'm not saying it's not a fun game. I'm just saying that it's no longer a game that's balanced. It's a game that is literally, it tells you, it's like, it's going to be a completely chaotic experience. They had to make special modes in order for it to be balanced. And they did that with the man versus machine mode, where you played in a team and you only can lock in certain characters. They borrowed elements actually from Overwatch with that. So it's kind of the same idea, where in order to balance things, they had to kind of figure out what worked and what didn't.
Overwatch was released by them?
The Man vs. Machine. There's the early drops of it. Yeah. Because remember, Team Fortress has been going for a long time. But
no, I know that, but I thought like Man vs. Machine was before 2016.
Pretty sure it was around the same time period because they had the same draft picking as Overwatch at that point. So I could be wrong. Maybe it came out a little bit earlier, but it was pretty close in that timeline. So it's somewhere like Team Fortress only officially kind of died off in like the last 2 years, like really, really officially. Like, and even then they're still doing holiday updates for free. So it's kind of hard for me to say, but I'm pretty sure it was around the same time period because they have very similar systems.
Well, not anymore. Last year, there hasn't been a single update in the last 2 years, I think.
Yep. So it's officially died off. So
yeah, Man vs. Machine released way before Overwatch, 2012.
Okay, so I was mistaken about that, but you can see how a lot of those. Then maybe it's the other way around, and maybe Overwatch borrowed from their idea of how they kind of had the classes balance out because they had a very similar selection screen where you can figure out like the character and you only can lock into certain types of characters when playing that mode. But that kind of existed in other games too, so I could just be wrong on that and just they borrowed it for something else. The point is, games aren't exactly original, so like for everything I'm wrong about, there's chances are they borrowed it from something else and I just didn't realize it. It's just kind of nature of games. But my point is that even a game like that used to be extremely balanced, and it's become unbalanced as time has gone on. And though it's still fun, it's not something that's very fair, and that's kind of my point. Its presentation is all over the place, and it's kind of like leading back to this the slide here. Make sure you present your core in a way that makes sense to your player. When you're explaining things, when you're showing things, you don't want there to be surprises when a player plays a game. You want to make sure that you have all your elements of your game listed out. Everything makes sense. It's presented in a very easy to understand manner. Hanabi is a great example of a game that has very little and has a lot of gameplay you can choose from because they're just colored cards and tokens. That's it. You don't need more. And it's very straightforward to know numbers 1 through 5 and red, blue, green, yellow. It's very straightforward. So even a game like Uno, when they explain things that's easy for most people to grasp, they sometimes can offer a rule change, and a minor rule change can change the feeling of the game altogether. Remember, as I, in the previous lecture, talked about the house rule of Uno, with passing go collecting $200, we all have played that version, and we've all played the version where taxes go in the middle and you get that as part of collection with landing on free parking, but that's technically not a rule, that's a house rule. Uno had a thing that came out last year where you said you didn't need to pull a card until you have a color that matches the discard pile. So this became a big thing for people because that whole stacking behavior that's really fun in Uno to like see people go from 1 card to 100 technically no longer existed because of this. It actually changed the behavior of the game. And a lot of people flat out refuse to play the game with that new rule. So even a minor change can drastically change the feeling of the game. It can change the balance and it can change the immersion of the game itself. So all these choices as a designer, you have to be very careful on it. You have to be careful on how much you give to your player, how much you change, and what is a fair thing and what doesn't feel fair, and also what feels balanced. Like, is it a dominant strategy or a non-dominant strategy? Think of it all in that regard. So kind of to wrap up today's lecture, just kind of give a summary. It's time to figure out what competitive structure you want to start with. Again, the slide has all the different gameplay structures, 1v1, all v all, one versus many, versus system. It's time to figure out what type of game you're making. And it's time to figure out what sort of decision making you want to do in the game. What's the core foundation? Remember, strong foundation builds strong gameplay. So are you doing a deck building game? Are you doing a social deduction game? Figure out what you want to build. And then anything you create, balance it that it feels fair. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% balanced number-wise. It just needs to feel fair. And feeling fair is not the same thing as balancing perfectly, to be symmetrical. That's not the same. And that you saw in the video, as they mentioned, that sometimes doing it all based on numbers and math, it's not fun. You have to figure out what feels fun to a player. Sometimes asymmetry works very well.
Yeah, one main way to think of that, it's an argument that I heard. The most balanced fighting game ever is Street Fighter 1, where you could only play as Ryu and Ken, and they were literally the same character.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would...
and that's also the most boring fighting game ever. Well, not boring, but compared to any standard today, it's not a good one.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very compared to everything else that exists. But yeah, let me answer chat. The game time says 5 to 20 minutes. Is that absolute? It could be a little bit over, but I don't want you to make a game that's like an hour and a half or whatever, because realistically, you only have so much time to play test and get people play test with you. So I don't want you to make a game that's overly long, because it's very hard to balance that out. But it's okay if it's a little bit longer, but if it's shorter than 5 minutes, that's a problem.
I have a
then
question.
You better have a game that's best of rounds. Yeah, 30 minutes is fine. It's not a big deal.
I'm assuming you'll probably maybe go over this in the next lecture or next week. How are we supposed to prototype this? I mean, are we going to use Tabletop Simulator? I mean,
well, there's a whole ILA about how to put games online using GameStructor. There should be an ILA in there. It says that.
Okay.
It should be available in week 2. I'll double check real quick to make sure I'm not telling you otherwise.
It was there just recently.
Yeah, it's there. I was looking at it earlier.
Right, but he's but you guys are probably online students. I know that David's a campus student, and those are slightly different.
Okay.
So I just want to double check and make sure that I did accidentally not include it, because I normally don't have it.
Not looked through everything for week 2 yet.
Yeah, putting card games online students only. There's a whole ILA in here that goes over how to put games on GameStructor, and there are videos on how to use it. And then you can just give each other links, and you can play games back and forth that way. And it's all free.
Okay.
So any questions about anything additional with today's lecture?
Next one is Wednesday?
Next one's Wednesday, same time.
Wednesday, same time.
Just let you know, I sent you a message on FSO. If you could, I know you're busy and everything.
I'll read your messages after we're done with lecture, and I'll get back in touch with you.
Right, cool.
If it's something that you just want to talk privately, just shoot me a message on Discord, because I'm available right now, and we can just talk.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, if that's the case, then I will see you all on Wednesday at 5 o'clock, and hopefully I will not be stressed out. So
good luck. Good luck with
your housing stuff.
Yep. You'll find out if I live in a cardboard box or not. I'll let you all know.
Yes, sir.
All right. You all take care and have a good evening.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Later, guys.
Later.